Hey everyone, it's Heather.
It's hope.
And it's Heidi, welcoming you to another episode of Finding Our Way Through, a podcast designed to help navigate the inevitable complexities of life. So, wherever you are and whatever it is you're trying to find your way through, we're so glad you found your way here to this podcast. So, at the start of last week's podcast, we took some time to answer a question from a member of our listening community, and we thought we'd try that again. Of course, we would love some feedback from you to let us know, as listeners, if you like that we're taking the time to do this at the start of our podcasts. Let us know what you think by sending us an email at info@findingourwaythrough.com. And of course, we would love for you to like us and follow us on our YouTube channel, Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok pages as well. We would love to hear from you. All right. So, Heaven Hope, are you ready for this week's question from one of our listeners?
Drum roll, please.
Oh, that's hysterical. Okay. Well, now that the drum roll has played, here's the question. How are your relationships with one another really? Do all three of you get along as well as the podcast would seem to suggest that you do? Which one of you guys would like to take a stab at that question? Hope?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I would say thanks to our listening community and especially the
Yeah.
listener who posed this question. It's a really good one. And I think I would say the short answer is that yes, generally we get along very well. The only way I think to explain it is that we have this innate connection, right, based on our birth experience. We're identical
Mm.
triplets. We shared the same womb. There wasn't a lot of room in there. We were pretty crowded. And we we came into the world 4 minutes apart. So we have this shared childhood, and I would say, therefore, a shared experience. Um, I think the longer answer is that relationships are really only as good as the time you spend on them. And what I mean
Mm.
by that is, in our adult lives, I'm not sure we've necessarily prioritized one another.
Mm.
I mean, partly because we've spent a good deal of our lives trying to separate from one another, as we referenced in our first podcasts, to really find our own identity. And so we've moved, I would say, a little bit further from each other as opposed to toward each other. And I
Mhm.
think also because of the connection that we have, maybe we just didn't feel like we needed to. I think you'd both say kind
Mm.
of like when you see an old friend and you sort of just slip back into the natural way of interacting with one another. Do
Mhm.
you both agree
Definitely.
with that?
Yeah, Yeah, for definitely. sure.
So what else might you tell our listeners about our relationship?
Yeah, so I would just say that for context, I would say that you and Heidi have probably historically been a little bit closer. And I think that's because you spent more time together in high school and you also went to college together.
Yep.
Yeah. And I can honestly say that I know that wasn't meant to make me feel sort of less included or less connected.
Never.
I know it had a lot to do with kind of my own circumstances at the time, which I'll reference later when we talk about finding my path to the one. But I'd also say that as adults, Hope and I have lived geographically closer to one another, which I think has made it a bit more feasible for us to see each other more often than we see Heidi. And we both had children at the same time, so we've been able to really bond around those experiences. Um, I mean, Heidi, would you say anything or add anything?
Um, I would say that generally what you guys have said is totally something that I agree with. I would also say that while we get along well, there are times I think when we might not be as honest with one another as we could be. And what I mean by that is, there are sometimes I think when I might say, like, well, should I say that? How would you feel about that? I think we
Yeah.
kind of all tend to be pleasers,
Mm.
and so can tend to sort of avoid some conflict. And so what I'm excited about in regard to the podcast is that I think we're creating the space to, learn how to do that a little bit more easily with one another. That's sort of what I would add to
Yeah,
it. So
Complete.
I'm hoping that, the answer to that question that a listener posed is one that they feel like has been answered, as openly, as honestly as we could.
Heather,
So
anything else? Heather, you look like
yeah,
you're going to say something.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I was just going to say that, and you guys have both alluded to it, but, I do think that we share, a very unique bond that's characterized by love and mutual support for one another. And obviously many shared and funny memories together. And I think most importantly, that we've got a great deal of respect for one another, and that our connection really allows us to see and understand one another. So again, at this time in our lives, I really do hope we're able to prioritize one another some more.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Thanks for adding that. Okay, well, on to today's topic, you guys, for the podcast.
Yep.
So it's finding our way through to the one.
The
And
one.
yay, right?
Yay.
So
Yeah.
you know that what we mean by the one is like the person, those people that we ended up marrying. And guys, I don't know if, you remember the original Grease movie that I think we like lived for when we were younger.
Saw
How
like,
could
I
we
don't know
forget?
how many times did we see that movie? We
Yeah,
did a
and I think we
play.
Wait, do you remember?
Remember the play?
yes.
We did a
Like
play in
Yes,
elementary
the
school.
Gary School play.
Yeah,
Yes.
in second grade. I'm
Thank you,
pretty
Mrs.
sure.
Carlin.
An all female cast.
Do you remember what roles you played? I was a little munchkin.
I don't remember. I think I was Rizzo, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I honestly can't remember who I played. I think you were Rizzo for sure.
I remember Sandy Likens was like my partner in crime in that one.
Yeah, she was Sandy or Danny or something, I think, wasn't she?
Maybe. No,
Okay.
I don't
Danielle,
know, Meg.
maybe.
I think Meg and
Meg and
Danielle.
Danielle were Danny and Sandy, I think.
Danny and Sandy.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
It's so funny.
Yeah.
so funny. But how could we forget? Yes, we remember.
Okay.
Hashtag
Well,
obsessed with that movie.
yeah.
Maybe still a little bit.
So you remember like John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John, right? Like I think it was the end of the movie where they sang that song, you're the one that I want. Ooh, now honey. Ooh, 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 the one that I want. And then like he starts singing like, you can sing along with me if you want, but like I got chills, they're multiplying,
It's all
and
you,
I'm
hi.
losing control. And he's like, for the power you're supplying, it's electrifying. Remember? And like,
I'm impressed by your voice right
I
now.
know, me too.
Thank
Wow.
you so much. But like, remember like when he's doing that, it's electrifying move in the movie, he, it's like this weird kind of body wave that he does. But I guess that was like him just maybe trying to sing about the chemistry he felt for Sandy. I'm not sure.
I think so.
For sure.
But anyways, it was like the one that I want. So in talking about the one today, I guess,
Yeah.
the ones for us are Matt, Jim, and Todd respectively.
Shout out
and
to
for,
Matt, Jim, and Todd.
yeah.
Love you guys.
And for our listeners, it's going to be their one, or it's going to be the hope of their one, or it's going to be the heartache of their one.
Mhm.
And guys, I was wondering, since we're mentioning Matt, Jim, and Todd, like when you told Jim and Matt that we were talking about this on the podcast today, since we haven't really talked about our husbands too much since starting the podcast, like how did they feel about it? Were they cool with you guys, like, knowing that you were going to talk about them?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Matt, true to form, was like, go for it, babe. I am an open book.
That's so Matt. That's such a Matt response, Heather.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
What about Jim?
Yes, Jim was the same. Jim was like, honey, anything you want to talk about is fair game. So have at it.
Oh yeah. I mean, Todd, he just laughed at me. He was like, he actually repeated the question back to me. He said, so you're wondering how I feel about you talking about me on the podcast? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm wondering. And he just looked at me and he was like, great. I feel great about it. So, and then we just totally started laughing. So it's good. It's good to know that
It's
we
so
have,
funny.
the support and encouragement of our ones, those
Yes.
We are
people we've been
blessed.
married
Yeah,
to
we
for
are
a long time.
blessed. We're all very lucky. Yeah.
So as we start to talk about finding our paths to the one, we'll also be talking about types of relationships generally that we found ourselves having to navigate or not in Heather's case, because she married her high school sweetheart. But those paths we had to, relationships we had to navigate before meeting the one. Like I said, all three of us have different stories, and that Heather married, her high school sweetheart. Heidi, me, I married a man I met after graduating college, and Hope met her husband in her late 20s, and I think she was almost 30, who
Yes.
was divorced and who had two young kids. Our hope is that our listeners will find at least one of our stories relevant to their own. And a few things before we get started. I just wanted to mention that, if most of our lives revolve around our personal and professional relationships, really in that, they're essential to us as human beings, don't you think, guys, that there'd be classes on relationship success that would be offered in educational systems we frequent, like middle school, high school, and college? And I say middle and high school in particular because, that's the period of time where, boys and girls are starting to like one another, and like all these hormones are coming online. And, it's like just a tough time to try to figure out how to navigate those relationships.
Yeah,
So,
and I think at that age too, there's
Yeah.
just, so many kids just don't have the tools in their toolboxes to navigate relationships, communicate effectively, you name it. Hope, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wish that that was the case. I think there's
Mhm.
probably nothing more important than teaching young kids,
yeah.
elementary school, high school, middle school, high school, about what it's like to interact in a healthy relationship. It would be really, really incredible if courses like that existed. I think it would help a lot of young women and men to understand, what a good relationship looks like.
Yeah, right. Like just classes like recognizing signs of healthy relationships or red flags in relationships or
Yes.
steering
Oh,
clear of
absolutely.
emotionally abusive, destructive ones.
Yes.
Most
Definitely.
important.
Yeah, that
Yes.
information that could help us know that like we're choosing the best person for us who we ultimately hope will be the one.
Mhm.
Um, or even classes that teach people about this thing called attachment theory and family dynamics. I know we've referenced it a little bit in past podcasts, but outside of taking courses in college, um, on attachment theory and family dynamics. I mean, those courses aren't part of regular gen ed classes for every major. And so really if, the common denominator in living is people, and we have to figure out how to navigate all kinds of relationships, not just romantic ones, it really is mind-boggling to me that there's not more out there for people to help them that way. And I mentioned attachment theory was credited to John Bowlby and others like Mary Ainsworth, Mary Main, Philip Shaver, to name a few. But it just describes how the relationship styles that we see modeled in families early on in our development, like that modeling, it underlies our belief systems about all our future relationships. Now, what that means is that what we come to expect about the relationships that we have, what we believe to be true about them, and how we behave and act in relationships themselves, it has everything to do with what we see modeled early on. I mean, guys, that is in and of itself a pretty profound and powerful statement. Would you agree? Like when I say that, what comes to mind for you?
I think for me, I mean, that's you know, I need to think about that.
Mhm.
It's a pretty deep set of words that you just sort of expressed. So it just sort of makes me think about my relationships, not just with my one, but with everyone in my life,
Yeah.
and how
Yeah.
what I learned growing up has impacted those relationships. That's a pretty, yeah, what you said, it's a pretty profound thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, Hyde, I mean, again, I'm gonna repeat profound, and I'm gonna repeat what you said, that early relationships with caregivers shape a person's social and emotional development throughout their life. You just have to sort of sit and resonate with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. I know it makes me want everyone learn about themselves and the kinds of family systems they come from, sort of like, consider what they saw modeled relationally, what was
Yeah.
Yeah,
good, what wasn't good, what was
right.
healthy, what was dysfunctional, really, so that if there are negative behavioral patterns based on what, people saw modeled, that they don't get repeated. And, often we don't do the work early to be relationship savvy. And, we do tend to gravitate toward what we know, toward what's familiar, without any idea or real awareness that that is actually what we're doing. So gosh, it would be so helpful just to kind of understand that before we, find ourselves in long-term sort of committed dating relationships. And I think, second, because we're made for relationship, and what I mean is we are completely dependent on it for survival when we arrive in the world. And because we find meaning, belonging, and purpose in relationship as human beings, we're going to tend to experience a great deal of loneliness and emotional distress when we experience social or relationship isolation. And so any researcher on human and social emotional development is going to point to those truths. And then I guess because, Hev, Hope, and, I, like, because the three of us are heterosexual, cisgender females, we're going to be talking in the podcast from that perspective, as we mention age-related, socially constructed norms about expectations regarding big life events like marriage. This idea about the fantasy of finding Mr. or Mrs. Right, or that knight in shining armor meets the damsel in distress kind of experience. It's like that idea that we get kind of spoon fed to us as, as females in the culture. We're gender socialized that way. So like when marriage doesn't happen on schedule, and Hope, you'll probably allude to this a little bit when you talk about meeting the one, but the schedule really is sometimes sometime in the mid 20s, people can start to feel a great level of fear, upset, and distress that they're not going to end up finding the one and get the happily ever after sort of in relationship. And so like while the three of us are married, we want to say to those listening who long to be married but are still navigating their path to the one, we feel for you and for that unmet desire of yours. For those of you who thought you found the one and your story of the one ended in heartbreak and divorce, we feel for you as well. And to those of you who found the one and are still married to the one, you know just how much work it takes to make a marriage a healthy and a successful one. And of course, I say that because according to the American Psychological Association, 40 to 50% of first marriages end in divorce, 60 to 70% of second marriages end in divorce.
Wow.
And
pretty high
it's
statistics.
Huge statistics, right?
Yeah.
And, of course, there are issues that come up with step parenting and blending families that increase the divorce rate in second marriages. But what it also indicates, I think, to me, is that we take ourselves with us wherever we go. And if we aren't trying to figure out how to be the healthiest versions of ourselves we can be, we're going to keep repeating behaviors that leave us struggling in our relationships. So, having sort of said all that, you guys, let's bridge into the actual topic today. Hev, let's get started with you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you want to share your story about finding the one?
I sure will. So basically, and it's a funny story, how I met Matthew. So Matt is from a big family like us. He has 5 siblings, so there are 6 kids in the family. And, for context, Matt is number 6 in the lineup, and his sister Liz is, Matt's number 5 in the lineup, and his sister Liz is number 6. And that's kind of important in a minute. But I met Matt when I was a freshman in high school. I was 14 years old, and he was a junior in high school. He was 16 years old. And essentially, Matt thought that we, collectively, the triplets, were cute. But he didn't know us, given the age difference. But he had, seen us over the years at church, riding our bikes, or one of our favorites, swimming at Commercial Street. So he asked Liz, the sister previously mentioned, for some help. So Liz was in our grade and was our friend. So, Matt basically said to Liz, "Hey, which triplet doesn't have a boyfriend?" Do you guys remember that?
I actually don't remember that is what he said to his sister. That's hysterical.
Yeah.
It is hysterical. I don't remember it. I think I've heard that story.
Yeah.
I think I've heard the story. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it happened to be me at the time. So so he asked Liz to ask me if I would go on a date with him. And this is funny because I thought that Matt was obviously handsome. And I had heard that he was, a very nice guy. But I also thought that he was a senior. And I was like, OMG, mom is never going to let me go on a date with a boy who is 3 years older than me.
Mhm.
But then Liz, assured me that he was a junior. And, it was just a 2-year age difference. So I was like, oh, 2 years is no big deal, right? Because 2 years
Yeah.
is so much shorter than 3 years,
Yeah,
The
exactly.
teenage
Great.
mind of
mind,
a teen.
the teenage mind. Yeah,
Exactly.
Hey, it's a workaround, right? Try to figure out how do you
Workaround.
get what you want.
Exactly. So,
exactly.
long story short, I told Liz that I'd go on a date with him. And I remember that I was actually babysitting at the time when he first called the house, but I wasn't home. So when I got home, I think it was our sister Steph that told me a boy named Matt had called for me and gave me his number. So I actually had to, guess what, you guys, call him back.
Yeah.
You actually had to pick up a phone and speak to somebody?
I did.
Wow.
The
Phones
time when we
existed
didn't
back
have
then?
cell phones or
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah, no
So
texting.
if
Do you
boys and girls
remember
wanted,
the phone behind the wall in the kitchen with the long cord?
and
Or
the
was the
rotary
phone
dial,
was the phone in the kitchen?
it
Was it in
was.
the kitchen and we had to go behind and sit in that chair that was kinda behind the wall to have some
I think
privacy?
so.
We did.
But you know what is just hard to believe? Like one phone for, I mean, gosh, at the
For
time there were like four teenage girls, right? Because Faith was a couple years older than us. So like,
Yeah.
yeah,
having to wait in line to make a phone call
I
after,
remember
it's
it.
like,
Yeah,
okay, guys, you've been on the phone kind of a long time.
and getting
Oh, you
upset
remember
with each
call
other. We
waiting
were like, "Get
too?
off
Call
the phone.
waiting?
Get off the
Yeah,
phone now.
right.
Do you guys
You've been
remember
on the
call
phone too
waiting?
long." Yes,
Yeah.
call waiting, hilarious.
I mean, we would, be really upset with each other and say, please get off the phone now. So
Yes.
anyway, so
Imagine our kids today having to do that, right? Everybody has instant gratification with their cell phones constantly.
I mean, and that is absolutely, to our listeners, a topic for another conversation when we talk about the Snapchat and Tinderization of America. You guys think so? Good topic?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking
Yeah.
about navigating sort of social
So
media stuff
anyway,
at some point in time.
Matt
I
and
think
I,
that would be a good
became a
topic.
couple, and we dated all throughout high school. So and that references a point about, relationship. We spent a lot of time together. But then we broke up actually right when I was starting college, which was pretty heartbreaking for me at that time. But we remained friends during that time, because we always had this deep connection to one another. And, I think during the few years that we were apart, we didn't see each other that often, but we would talk to each other, probably a couple of times a month, for updates on what was happening in each other's lives. And, I would just say that, at that time I was in college and spending time with friends, and Matt was working and spending time with another girl. And really, I think it was during that time that we really just missed having each other's physical presence in our lives. And then it was during the last few months of mom's life that Matt and I started talking more regularly. He was always supportive and so easy to talk to about, how I was feeling at the time. So we ended up getting back together shortly after mom died. Um,
Mm.
and then, again, I was definitely a little bit fearful, dating again, just because of the heartbreak that I felt when we broke up. But,
I
I
remember
do
the
know that,
heartbreak. I remember you
yeah.
going through that
Oh
time.
gosh,
Heidi,
yeah.
I'm sure you do
It was,
too. Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
I do.
awful, I
It was
yes,
remember.
really hard for you
yeah.
to
It was,
Yeah.
it was,
to
it
watch you
was,
be
yeah,
so sad.
definitely so sad. But I do know that, but they say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and it definitely
True.
made me stronger. And, I think being apart from each other, I think really helped us appreciate one another, and the shared values and beliefs. And again, oddly helped, I think, deepen our connection to one another. And, I guess guys remember too that, we're high school sweethearts, but we didn't get married, at 18 years old, like a lot of high school
Right.
sweethearts do, or 20. We got married when we were 28 and 30 years old.
Mhm.
So we were together for several years before marrying. And I think, kind of during that time, both of us were, spending time with friends and working and building careers. So over sort of those collective dating years, we underwent a lot of individual growth and change. And importantly, I think we did our best to champion and support each other's pursuits and gave each other space to explore the relationship and watch how it evolved over time. So I think, long story short, we learned a lot about each other's strengths and weaknesses and challenged each other to kind of do and be better. And I think, we were definitely around a lot of people, at the time, like some in healthy relationships and others in not so healthy relationships. So we were like, man, are we lucky to have one another, and it goes back to those shared beliefs and value systems. So Heidi, I don't know if you want me to talk about, how I knew he was the one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I would say that, okay, so when we're talking about the one, I think that in determining if a person, is the one, obviously for all of us and all of our listeners, very deeply personal, and differs for everybody. But for me, I have always known, Matt was the one for me, just given the depth of his character, to be honest. He's someone who makes me feel seen. He's always made me feel seen. He's incredibly kind and treats people with, respect. He's always been so convicted in himself, and comfortable in his own skin. Really never changed who he was to fit in with any particular group. And you guys remember that. I mean, not even in high school when kids experience a ton of peer pressure.
I remember, sorry to interrupt, but the number one thing that cracks me up about Matt is that he has a nickname for everyone and everything. Like
Still to this
rope-a-dope
day.
is the nickname for me. And like the funny story about Matt, this is just so funny. I had an English Springer Spaniel and he had gigantic paws, and Matt's nickname for him was Snowshoe.
Oh, it's the best.
And every time someone would see our dog and like reference the fact that our dog had really big paws, they're like, "Oh, your puppy's so cute." And I'm like, "No, he's fully grown. He's a fully grown dog." But my brother-in-law calls him Snowshoe, and everybody would laugh so hard. Seriously, I told that story so many times. But I just wanted to say, Matt's nicknames are classic.
R.I.P. Max too. What a great dog.
Yeah, so great.
He was such
Hunker,
a good dog.
shout out to Hunker.
Yeah. Heidi, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything before I just finish up.
No, go ahead, finish up.
Yeah, and I was also going to say too, like the one other thing that I loved about Matt is just, that he's so skilled, really. I've always admired his engineering brain because I don't even have one single ounce of it. And funny enough, Matt's mom used to say that, Matt could do anything, and it's so incredibly cheesy, but it's true in that, he's kind of like this mechanical whiz. He can build you a house, he can build you a 50-foot boat, he can fix your car, you kind of name it. And when we see people in town, like there are just countless stories of people telling me that they consulted Matt on what type of power boat to buy when he was like 12 years old. It's like really crazy. But I think bottom line for me, he's just that kind of person that everybody wants to be friends with or know. Everybody loves Matt Finn. And I loved that about him. And I knew that he would be someone who would really love me for me, someone I could rely on, and someone who would really build me up whenever I was feeling down.
Yeah,
so who's next?
Yeah, well, I love how that, you shared the backstory with us, and some of that was good to be reminded of for sure, because it's been a while since we've kind of talked about like our stories. And so Hopi, you next.
Yes.
Let's talk about how you met your one, lessons you learned in relationships prior to finding your one.
Yes.
I guess talk about those first, and then how, did meeting Jim change that for you, or like what gave you the confirmation he was the one?
I would love to talk about that. So yes. So Heather, that was great to hear that story again. It's been a little while. So I would say my path to my one is definitely different than Heather's and longer and had some twists and turns. And like they say, sometimes you need to kiss a few toads to find your prince.
I love that. That's so true.
In my case, I think on my way to the one, I'll talk about two important relationships, and I'm only going to talk about them briefly, but I think that there's a lesson in each of those. So the first I'll mention is my college boyfriend, and Heidi, you will remember him because you spent a lot of time with him as well.
Yeah, I loved him.
He was one of the girls.
Yep.
But
he was one of the girls.
Yeah, we dated for the last, I guess, 2.5 years of college. And I think somewhere in my 22-year-old mind, I thought we would be together long term. And I think I think the relationship was important or significant as well is because he experienced mom's illness with me.
Mhm.
Because mom was sick the last 3 years that we were in school. And so, he was a big part of kind of going through that journey with me. Um, and so I think we were connected in a way that a lot of people at our young age aren't. And, I mean, as I said in our last podcast, I mean, we all graduated, a week or two after mom died. And then 2 months later, I moved to Japan, to teach English. And so I think when I moved to Japan, I naturally thought that we'd stay together. And that was not the outcome. We did not stay together. And so, in conjunction with grieving mom, I was also dealing with truly like my first heartbreak.
Yeah.
And so
Awful.
that was, yeah, it was awful. It was a really hard time for me. And it was one that was filled with, to be very honest, I mean, it was filled with a lot of tears. The heaviness of losing someone as significant as a mom, topped with the reality of losing the person who I really relied most on for emotional support during that time period.
Mhm.
Super, super hard. But, I do think that the lessons that I learned from that relationship were also very important to me. I would tell everyone out there that communication is the most important thing in a relationship. It's so key. Um, and, I think for me, in that relationship, I sort of just assumed that we would stay together and that he was maybe reading my mind and he wanted the same
Mm.
thing as me. But we didn't communicate. We never talked about what that relationship might look like post college. And so, if anyone in our listening community, is in a relationship, don't be afraid to talk about what that relationship might look like long term,
Yeah.
because it could save a lot of heartache earlier on. And I think I also learned that in relationships, it's hard to control outcome. I think if the two people in a relationship aren't completely aligned on where they see the relationship going, it probably won't have, the outcome that one of those people may want. So if you're not aligned and you're not kind of working toward sort of the same outcome, there might be heartbreak for one person in that relationship longer term. And I think the last thing about that I'll talk about is, time does heal a broken heart. It definitely
Mhm.
came with tears,
Oh,
and it definitely came with time, but it also taught me a lot about my ability to kind of get through what I would say was, a very emotionally trying time period for me. Um, so that was the first kind of significant relationship. The next one I'll talk about was a long-term relationship. It was with a person that I met when I lived in San Francisco. So, for our listeners, right, I moved after I lived in Japan. I was back in my hometown for a few months, and then I moved out west to San Francisco. And I was in that relationship for 6 years. Long, long, long time. You both absolutely will remember, the ups and downs for me in that relationship. You probably heard me talk about it way too many times. Um,
Yeah.
but
I'm
I
glad we were
think,
here to listen.
yeah, no, me too. Thank you so much, because you were part of the reason why I kind of finally saw my way through to the other side to sort of leave that relationship. Um, but if I'm being honest, that relationship, I think I always knew, like, that he wasn't the guy for me. I never
Mhm.
felt totally connected, and I never really felt like I was in love. I never had that like, you
Wow
know,
factor.
that wow factor. It was honestly more, the relationship was more familial, right? Like,
Mm.
we loved to do a lot of the same things. Um, and so we were very good friends, but I never really saw myself building a future with this person long
Mm,
term. And I think a lot of folks in our listening community are probably in relationships like that, where they really love the person that they're with, but they're not in love with the
but it's
Mhm.
person
comfortable.
that they're with. It's very comfortable. Um, and so
That
I
idea
guess,
that, like, maybe it's better to be together than alone.
exactly. I think a
Yeah.
lot of people get stuck in that, oh my gosh, I don't want to go out there and be single again. That doesn't seem, like it would be very fun. And they're sacrificing really their opportunity to find the one. And I don't want to say, someone in that situation is settling. But I think a lot of people do because they let fear kind of creep into the cracks. So I think I would say that I stayed in that relationship longer than I should have. I would also say, just again, being very honest, fear really drove that decision. Like I just said, we were friends. We did a lot of we did a lot of the same things together. We did a lot of outdoorsy things. I mean, it worked for a lot of reasons, but I was constantly second guessing myself. Afraid that maybe he was right for me. Um, Afraid that if we broke up, like we just said, I wouldn't find someone else. And then also, age absolutely factored in. Heidi, you mentioned, I didn't find my one until I was late 20s. I think I was 30. Because, right, of that societal stigma, that, that by the time, someone, any person is like in their 30s, they should be married with kids. And so it can be scary. And I really struggled in that relationship. And there really was an aha moment for me where I was like, okay, this has been a really long time. We've been together for what seems to be an eternity. And this is not going where he wants it to go. It's not going where I want it to go. And we need to be strong enough to kind of walk away and end this. And we did. We got to that place. It took longer. It's one of those things, you guys, that if I knew then what I know now, that relationship wouldn't have been 6 years, right?
Yeah.
But I did learn. I mean, I learned a ton from that. And I think, one of the biggest learnings, and I'm hoping that folks in our listening community hear this, please trust your gut always. If you have that little voice in your head that keeps telling you the relationship isn't right, don't fight that little voice. Like, try your hardest to listen to that little voice, and don't be afraid to communicate and tell the partner that you're with sort of where you see things long term. I guess just try to put the fear aside, because again, you can save yourself a lot of time, and you're missing out on the opportunity to actually like find the one. The other thing I would say is don't listen to other people. They're not in your relationship, so don't get caught up in someone else's idea of your relationship.
Great
Because
advice.
Yeah.
because time, I mean, time's the one thing you can't get back, right? And if you're spending time in an uncertain relationship, it's time lost finding that person. But it is super hard. Emotions are all over the place when folks are in a relationship that they just don't know or don't have certainty about. And it's really easy to get caught up in those relationship antics.
But
But
Hope,
I also,
I
yeah,
I was going to
go
say,
ahead, Head.
I'm so sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but like I
No,
remember
no, please.
kind of like the countless conversations we had at that time about the relationship, and you always like, you were always like, just something just doesn't feel right, and you kind of always knew that. And I remember how proud, Heidi and I were of you when you found the courage and the strength to kind of walk away because you knew it wasn't right.
Thank you for saying that. Again, it's hard, right? You get to a certain
Yeah.
age and you're like, oh my gosh, if this isn't going to be for me, what is going to be for me?
Mm.
But, Heather, I'm glad you said that, because I also feel that um, people come in, and out of our lives for reasons.
Oh.
And I learned a lot about myself at that time. And I'm really thankful for the experience, because ultimately it did lead me to my one. It led me to my prince.
Yep.
Well, let's talk
So
about him. Let's talk
yeah,
about your
so let's
prince.
talk about him. So this brings me to my one. My one happens to be my amazing husband, Jim. Um, and just a quick little backstory about Jim. I was originally introduced to Jim by our older sister, Faith, and his sister, Eileen. Our sisters had been friends for a while. And at the time, I was living in San Francisco and Jim was living in Philadelphia. And just a quick little story. Faith called me on the phone and said, "Hey, Hope, I have this great guy for you. All my friends think he's just awesome. He's so attractive." And she keeps going on and on about how amazing Jim is. And then at the end of the conversation, she's like, yeah, and he's divorced and he has 2 little girls. And I was like, wait a second. I was
Wait,
like, hang on.
What?
Wait,
Yeah,
what?
like, hold on, wait.
Like,
Rewind.
rewind. Wait, he's what? Because I mean, I was single. I was never married. I didn't have
Mhm.
kids.
Mhm.
And I, when I was talking to Faith, I was like, you want to introduce me to someone who's divorced? Wait a second. I'm not sure that's part of my plan. But regardless, we met, and he had business out in San Francisco. He was coming out there for a meeting, and Faith and her husband Brian ended up having a barbecue. Jim was there. We ended up talking the whole time. And honestly, I mean, the only way I can explain it is when I met him, I sort of instantly had this just connection, right? Like, I mean, I was physically attracted to him, but I felt like we were on the same page about so many things. And it was really like a feeling unlike anything I've ever experienced in my entire life. I was just so drawn to him. Um, and so, I think that was a Sunday. And I guess 4 days later, I was on a red eye airplane from San Francisco to Philadelphia to spend the weekend getting to know Jim. And so that was sort of the start of our relationship. But it was bi-coastal. So he was on the East Coast, I was on the West Coast. And I think in between seeing each other, we did a lot of emailing. I mean, we talked on the phone a lot, but we also emailed each other quite a bit. And we got to express ourselves, I would say, through the written word. And we still have some of those emails.
That's
Jim
so
has
cool.
them in a folder, and they're so incredibly funny to read now.
I'm
I mean,
sure.
OMG, they're so embarrassing. But it's funny. Sometimes we bring out the folder and we just laugh.
Oh, it's
I
so
love
great you
that.
have them.
It's
It's
so
awesome.
funny. But the more that I got to know him, and the more I got to see Jim for who he was. I mean, such a great person, so incredibly kind, one of the nicest people you could ever meet, thoughtful, incredibly communicative. And I also got to see that he was a great dad to his 2 young girls.
Yeah.
And that was really attractive to me. And so,
And Jim's such a good listener too.
he's such a good listener. And
And
so,
he does a great job sometimes, speaking with his English accent that, we all appreciate, the
He's
3
a
of
little bit
us.
better than you hope.
Yeah.
Haha.
He
you know
tries so
what?
hard.
He might be, but his
He
accent,
tries so hard.
no matter what accent Jim tries to do, he always ends up sounding like John Wayne in like in one of the Western movies, and one of the many Western movies that John Wayne was in.
So maybe he should start from like his John Wayne. He knows John Wayne
exactly.
accent.
If he starts with John Wayne, he'll just end with John Wayne.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But no, I mean, I think, my feelings for Jim were super, super strong. But I think as a single, never married 30-year-old, I really needed to be sure that getting involved with a man who had been divorced and had young kids was the right path for me. Right. So I knew I needed to go into the relationship with my eyes wide open. And to
Yeah.
do that, I did. I saw an incredible therapist, probably one of the best. And she just really helped me to understand that everyone has a history, everyone has a past, and his past was different than mine. And ultimately, I came to understand that the person that I met and fell in love with brought all of those experiences with him. And if he didn't have those experiences, perhaps he wouldn't have been the one. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think all of his experiences prior to meeting me, like my experiences prior to meeting him, brought us together. And at the time that we met each other, we were the one for each other. So I think, ultimately in conjunction with having super strong feelings, I just, decided that he was right for me. And
Awesome.
did you want me to go into sort of how I knew?
Yeah. Like just confirmation that he was the one.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I would say is, I guess I was willing to accept Jim for all he brought, and he was willing to accept me for all I brought to the relationship. But I think, very honestly, when I met Jim, I just had this, like this feeling that I had never felt before. this immediate connection I talked about, just a few minutes ago, and felt like he was such a safe place for me.
Mhm.
I didn't have to be anything more than I was. I didn't have to try. Our
He saw
conversation, our
you.
interactions. Yeah, he saw me. Our
Mm.
conversation, our interactions flowed so easily. We had mutual respect for one another, admiration for one another, beyond attraction.
Yeah.
Had the same values, thought similarly, and were really able to discuss things at great length. And all of those things are true today. I just feel so blessed to be walking through my life with him.
Mm.
And, I think the one quote, again, I don't know the author, but it's, we come to love not by finding a perfect person, but by learning to see an imperfect person perfectly.
Mhm. We're all perfectly imperfect.
Yes.
Yep. I think
It's a beautiful
that's,
quote.
yeah, that perfectly imperfect, I think, is from AA. So, kudos to AA for coming
Yeah.
up with perfectly imperfect.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, anything else hope
So
you want to add
hopefully that
before
gives you, no, I don't think so.
some context?
Hopefully that gives you a feeling for kind of how I navigated my path to my one. What
These
about
are
you,
all
Hyde? You want
Yeah,
to talk
let's
about
hear.
Tigre, El Tigre?
Give
El
us a
Tigre.
dish.
Me Tigre. Yes, well, it's fun to do this podcast just because like it helps me to like just be reminded of kind of what your stories are in terms of like your one. So we just haven't, like I said, talked about it for a long time. So it's fun. Yeah, well, you know me, I'll always say I had to go to South America to meet my husband, which I
Bolivia.
guess I guess things weren't going so well for me in the States, had to get out of the country. But before I guess I share that story about finding the one, I'm going to
Los
give you
Estados Unidos.
yes, Los Estados Unidos. I had to tengo que ir a Bolivia. I'll give you a brief summary of the relationships that, I had to navigate prior to meeting Todd. And so like in high school, I dated somebody for about 3 years. And again, like most teenage girls, I was excited that somebody I liked me back.
Right.
The relationship was really what I think a typical high school relationship can be, in the sense that, you have two pretty emotionally immature people trying to navigate like dating without any real guidance. So I just would say there was a lot of jealousy and insecurity on both sides. But over time, I think what it became for me was an emotionally abusive relationship. And Hope, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about being in the relationship with the person you were in for 6 years. Like, you don't know what you don't know until
So
like
true.
until you know it.
Mhm.
And so I was in that 3-year relationship, but it took me a long time to see it, to see how sort of unhealthy the relationship was. And I think partly because I felt a real connection and attachment to his mother.
Yeah.
And I think losing that attachment to her, which, not necessarily was it about losing the attachment to him, which really should have told me something, right? Pretty clearly. But it felt kind of painful on the heels of my experience with having lost dad. And so I think I
Yeah.
just stayed in it too long.
For sure.
But what I knew is that being in that relationship, at least what I eventually came to know, was that it made me feel really small and really bad about myself. And so, what I want to say for listeners out there,
Mm-hmm.
if you're in something like this, I would encourage you to leave and leave fast. A healthy relationship should make you feel loved, encouraged, and empowered. And if it doesn't, then finding your way through the relationship you're in currently means getting out of it. Like leave it and don't look back.
Yeah.
So
That's
that was
great,
like high
great, great
school.
advice, Heidi.
The best advice I had.
Thanks. And, we're not relationship experts, but we're just talking about our own experiences,
Absolutely.
having tried to navigate them. And, in college, prior to meeting Todd, the one, right? Like the relationships that I had were fairly short lived. And I think for me, I was operating from a place of serious protection. It was kind of like you can get this close to me, but you can't get any closer. And if I'm being honest, I do think that there was just a huge wall around my heart, probably because of the fear of loss and hindsight. And so I really wasn't too committed to anyone. And you might say, was I aware of the impact that loss was having on me at that time? And I would say, absolutely no, not really. I had some idea, But I came to see it more over time as I started paying attention to my own patterns of behaving, which, was helpful for me in that it did prepare me to let my guard down and actually let someone in when I actually met, when I met him, Todd. And so, yeah, so that was college. And then when I graduated from college, I think there was a part of me that had hoped I would meet the one in college. And again, I'm not sure I felt any pressure from anyone. I think it was just based probably on that hidden influence we mentioned earlier of like age related, socially constructed norms. You go to college, you meet somebody, you get a job, you marry them, you have kids, you build a family together. That was sort of the operating manual I was using. And I think honestly, it's like the operating manual most of us actually use.
Yes.
But
societal norms.
yeah.
Yes.
So after college, I left for the Peace Corps the summer after I graduated, and I lived with a Bolivian family near the volunteer training center in La Paz, Bolivia. And around 6 weeks of training, you get sent to visit the site that you're going to be living in for the next several years. So I was paired up with a few other trainees who were going to be living in the same geographic location that I was going to be living in. And so, when Peace Corps sends you out, they give you the name and the address of like a volunteer living in the city that you're visiting as kind of a contact person. And so
Makes
that
sense, yeah.
person that you get connected to, he kind of shows you around the city, orients you to the places of import, like the bank that your monthly stipend is going to be deposited in, and like where you have to go to find transportation to get out to your volunteer site, where you can kind of like haul or find a bus or, get a truck out there. So my fellow trainees and I, we took a taxi from the airport, and we had the taxi driver go to the address that we were given. And once we got there, this guy comes out of his apartment, and it was just actually like something in me just knew. Like honestly, the minute I saw him, I was like just thinking, oh my gosh, that's him. Like he's the one. Similar to sort of the feeling you had with Jim, Hope. And for me, I think I thought it was love at first sight. And he didn't know that, of course, but there was something that I felt. And I think in my mind, what was really appealing to me was that he's a Peace Corps volunteer. So I was like, a kindred spirit.
Yeah. No,
Service
definitely.
oriented.
Yeah,
absolutely.
he must really have a heart to help people. I was like, check, check, check that box. And so,
And he does.
And he does. Long story short, after that visit, I didn't see him until maybe 6 or 7 weeks later. It was November, and there was a volunteer Thanksgiving get together. After that event, I think it's when he asked me to be his girlfriend officially. And, knowing, of course, I was going to be a long way away from him. Like I lived 12 hours by bus or truck,
Crazy.
Wow.
from where he was. And so we got in the habit, similar to you again, Hope, of sending letters to one another, the written word,
Do you
in
have some
order.
of them? Do you have some of those letters?
We have all of them. Yes.
Oh my
And
gosh,
we
I
read
want
them
wow.
to see. I
periodically.
want to see all of your letters.
They're
It's
so
so
I don't know
embarrassing.
if I
And
want you to. I know they're so embarrassing.
the most embarrassing part
You
about our
might think
letters
less
was,
of me.
Never, ever.
seriously, it's like young love,
It
like
is,
these
it
things that you
is.
think are just like so amazing about these people. But like Todd and I actually, we started this like little like story about a tiger and a wildflower. Like I was flower and he was tiger or
Yeah.
tigre. I mean, it's like, pretty hysterical.
And to our listeners, their nicknames to this day are Flower and Tiger.
Yes, to those select few who we will, allow to call us those names. Yes.
Exactly.
The in group
Te
here.
amo, tigre.
But I think what's funny though. Te amo, tigre.
Thank you, Senor Michelson,
Heather, I
for my few Spanish words.
And what was the name of our Spanish teacher in high school? Actually, not like. Do you remember what her name was?
Oh gosh,
Senora something. Anyway. Well, anyway, guys,
I can't remember.
What's crazy about my relationship with Todd, though, is really, I think in total, we spent about 35 days together, like over a period of a year or more from the time we started dating until the time we got engaged. A lot of how we got to know each other literally was through the letters that we would write. There were no internet, there's no internet, there were no cell phones. So
it is amazing.
we would send
absolutely
letters
amazing.
to one another. I'd go to the bus stop in this town that I lived close to and was like, wait to see if there was it was called an encomienda, like this incoming letter for me. And so we would just get those and we'd write back.
You were probably so excited when you got one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so excited when I got one. Didn't know when it was coming, so that was always a little tricky. Like I'd show up sometimes and it wouldn't be there, and then I wouldn't be able to get back there for like another week, and they'd be kind of like waiting for me. So, um, but anyway, so he finished service in 1992, I think, and went to grad school immediately after he finished. So he left the country a year and some months before my service was up. And the funny thing is right, like to contact me after he left, he would have to call this national telephone service. So you'd
Wow.
have to go to this building and wait to have a phone call put through to you. So you get your name called and then you go sit in this little booth. So when he was leaving the country, he said, "Okay, in 6 weeks at this time on this day,
Oh
I'm
my
going to call
gosh.
you. So you have to be at that building to get this call." And so that's how we had to schedule our appointments.
Wow.
So like one day over a phone call, he said he was coming to see me during his October break. And at that time, I think I was having such a hard time in my site, just feeling so totally isolated all the time that I told him I
I
was
can
actually
just
thinking about,
imagine, Heidi.
yeah, it was a hard sort of place for me to be, especially like we talked about in an earlier podcast about having lost mom and just being so isolated and alone. But
But so
um,
brave of both of you to be so far away after experiencing such a profound loss too.
It
yeah,
was,
brave, but also kind of crazy if you
Yeah.
think about like just how
What were you
much we
thinking?
needed social support. Yeah. But anyway, when I talked to him at that time, I told him I was thinking about leaving, and which was hard because again, I was the kind of person who always finished what I started. But I did decide to come back to the States early. And when I got back, he proposed about 6 weeks after I got back. And I think we got married right before the start of his second year of graduate school. So, to answer like what made him the one, I think, again, hope it's similar to you in that it's hard to answer because there was just this intuitive knowing. I just knew. And
Yep.
so it was more about learning to trust my gut. But I think other than that, there was a chemistry I felt. He was very physically attractive to me. And of
Like John
course,
Travolta when he was singing to
Danny and Sandy.
like
Chills are
Danny when
electrifying.
like
He
Danny
was
when he was singing to Sandy.
he didn't do the weird body move that Danny did for Sandy with the electrifying thing, but yes, he came to realize, yes, he felt the same way about me. And of course, he had such a real heart for helping other people, which was attractive. He wasn't really selfish or self-centered person. He was so good with the people that he interacted with, like all of the Bolivians that he was working with. He just had such a way about his interactions with them that was just so appealing to me. He was so good with the kids that he was around, super personable, like so well educated, so smart, had a great work ethic. And it's funny because in hindsight, those were things I think the three of us were probably exposed to in our home life, like, with dad, hardworking, smart, well educated. So I think Todd fit the archetype for me. And so that's just like sort of defined as an original that's been imitated. And I know that sounds strange and probably creepy, but often for all of us, we tend to gravitate to what we're familiar with. Like I said, it's like that
Absolutely.
type that you
Yeah.
have, like who your type is. And it's often built on parent figures. But for me, there was more of an intuitive knowing, regardless of whether I understood archetypes at that time or not. So that is my story of how I had to go to South America to meet my husband.
Love that
LOL.
story. Love that
Yeah.
story.
Love
Thanks.
Tiger and Flower.
Yes,
So I know,
absolutely.
guys, it's getting late, and Heather and Hope just want to kind of start moving toward ending the podcast. Heather, what advice would you want to give to people in relationships with their high school sweethearts, kind of, helping navigate those types of relationships?
Can you repeat that, Heidi?
Yeah, Heather, what kind of advice would you want to give to people in relationships with high school sweethearts? Kind of how do you navigate those?
Yeah. I mean, thanks, Hyde. I think when you meet someone when you're young, it can be challenging because you undergo a lot of personal growth and change, during your late teens and early 20s. They say whatever full brain development is not until, mid 20s. And, that can sometimes lead to partners growing apart or, feeling like they've kind of outgrown each other. And again, Matt and I are high school sweethearts, but we also allowed each other to grow and change over our collective dating years. So I really do think that success in marrying your high school sweetheart really depends on a few things, right? I mean, you have to make sure that you're compatible. We always shared the same values and beliefs. I think, a really important thing is that you have to really be adaptable and grow together, really champion each other's individual pursuits. And that's not even specific to high school sweethearts. That's just specific to relationships in general. I think you have to have a great deal of respect for one another and value each other's opinions, treat each other with kindness, and, I think this is something we've all referenced about making sure you can communicate, because communication is so much, like is such a big piece of the equation. You have to be able to openly discuss your feelings and resolve, be able to resolve potential conflicts. And I think most importantly, I do think that sort of strong and enduring relationships really require commitment, right? I think you have to stay committed to a relationship and prioritize one another, because in this world where everybody gets busy, it's easy not to do that. Um, Again, communication really important, and then you need a strong willingness to adapt and grow together. So I think lots of efforts on both partners' parts is what I would say.
That's really good stuff. Hopi, what about you? And in terms of, the advice you would offer to those in a similar situation you found yourself in, dating someone who was divorced, or, get engaged to someone who's been married before and has children?
Yeah, I think the number one piece of advice is, you need to go into that relationship with your eyes wide open. What I would say is, if you're considering entering a relationship, you are in a relationship, or like considering marrying someone who's been divorced and there are kids involved, please recognize that anything that happens in your relationship doesn't just impact you and your partner, it also impacts the kids that are involved. So please, please be sure to handle those relationships carefully. And I think before considering getting involved with someone who's been divorced, make sure there's been some time. I think emotional healing is really important for everyone. I don't think anybody out there wants to be, in a rebound relationship with someone who's been divorced. There's a lot of heaviness that goes with divorce. And I think there's just a lot of time that needs to pass so that, you can be sure that that relationship has healed correctly, to make sure that that person's ready and able to give you what you're going to need in a good, healthy relationship. And then I also do think one helpful suggestion might be to go and talk to a therapist or a minister or a priest to help you answer some very important questions, to help you think through that dynamic, because I think it's very easy when you're in love. It's easy to think that loving someone is enough. But as I think we've all alluded to, marriage is a long journey. And when there are other people involved, might that be an ex-wife, an ex-husband, it presents another dimension to the relationship. So I would say just be sure to think it through with someone who can give you good counsel, to make sure that it's the right path for you. That is what I would say.
Yeah.
Hopefully that
And
helps.
Excellent advice.
Yeah, it is. And Hope, I love what you said about like loving somebody. Is it enough? Like I always think about that idea that love really is not a feeling, it's a decision. And that, you're making continual choices, right? You're making decisions continually
To stay committed.
stay committed,
to stay to work on it. Yeah.
to be patient, to be kind, to be, honest, to really fight for it. So,
to say you're sorry,
guys,
to apologize when things don't go the right way or your way.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just the humility to take responsibility and make sure that you're doing your part, keeping your side of the street clean. It's another AA sort of mantra, but
keeping your side of the street clean. I love that.
It's so true.
I know, it's so true.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know my path was different. Like I didn't marry a high school sweetheart or marry somebody in my, or meet somebody in my later 20s. Who was divorced with kids. I dated several types of people. And I think in the process for me, recognized what I wanted and what I didn't, and sort of what I allow in relationships and what I wouldn't. Didn't really have knowledge of boundaries or ideas about healthy relationships at that stage and age in my life. And so I think trial and error was the way I navigated my way through to eventually finding my one. And, I would say friends and family who know us and can be helpful to us, do they like us in the relationship? Do they see us as the best version of ourselves in this relationship? Are there real concerns? I mean, let friends who know you well and family speak into that space. I wish I had listened to several of my friends in high school who said the relationship I was in was a terrible one. And I think you guys probably said that to me too, but I didn't. And sometimes I think the lessons that we need to learn, kind of going back to what you said, Hope, about the relationship you were in for 6 years, is like lessons you learn along the way are born out of our suffering. So I certainly learned my lesson in that relationship in high school the hard way. but it's been useful for me. And so, like, I think also you mentioned therapy can be so helpful as well for those who are not learning from the mistakes that they might be making in relationships that they have. Connecting again to faith based principles that outline components of healthy relationships. For me, I wasn't steeped in Judeo Christian principles really before I got married, but after Todd and I got married,
Mm-hmm.
we have been part of a faith community, and I think those ideas about like patience, kindness, honesty, forgiveness, they've been tremendously helpful for me in regarding to navigating all relationships. And so I think for anybody, any stage and age, it's really important. Talk to people whose relationships you're exposed to who seem like, wow, they're a great match, and use them as a point of reference. That idea of I admire what I see in their relationship, and I want to find somebody like them. What can I learn from them to help me find that partner that I want to ultimately end up with? And yeah, and then I just encourage people to do the work to understand who they are and where they come from. Like we mentioned earlier with attachment stuff, how your family system has impacted the way you attach in relationship. Just try to
Yeah.
recognize patterns that aren't good and that can be discarded while attempting really to create newer, healthier patterns of behavior. And then like books, like I know I've mentioned to you guys before, but this book called How We Love by Milan and Kay Yurkovich is a wonderful book.
I agree.
Another book called Attached by Amir Levine and Rachel Miller can be helpful too. And then Leslie Vernick has some really great stuff out there regarding emotionally destructive relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Those can just be really great resources. So that's really all I wanted to add. So, of course, the three of us would say to all those people listening in our community, the hope is that, if you haven't found your one, you find your one, right? Like the one that you
Yes.
want. Ooh, honey. Ooh, ooh, ooh.
You're the one that I want.
Exactly. So, do you guys want to say anything before we end the podcast like we characteristically do?
Hyde, thanks for sharing that advice. It was so great. And, Hopi, I don't know if you have anything else to say. Or you're good? Okay. So I think I would just say, thank you so much again to our listening community for your support. Remember that you can find us at Finding Our Way Through on all podcast platforms,
Yeah.
Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Please like us, please follow us, please tell all your friends about us. And until next week, you got this.
You got this.